I'm Harriet Hageman, and I am the chairman of the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs. The United States is a Pacific power through its territories of Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. These territories are home to over 200,000 American citizens, and as such, the U.S. has an interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific that is free from a maligned influence. Furthermore, the United States holds special relationships with 3 Pacific Island nations known as the Freely Associated States, or FAS. These 3 countries are the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. Through compact agreements with these countries, the U.S. gains extraordinary security rights in return for U.S. economic assistance. The U.S. Department of Interior, through the Office of Insular Affairs, manages federal relations with the U.S. territories and FAS under the Compacts of Free Association, including administration and monitoring of grants, economic assistance, and federal programs as prescribed by federal statutes, and applicable agreements enacted into law. These interests and relationships are why we are here today. The People's Republic of China, or the PRC, is actively seeking to increase its influence in the region and undermine U.S. interests. The PRC has adopted a strategy of disruption and destabilization aimed at what I am told by one of our witnesses has described as political and social entropy in small, vulnerable nations. I hope we can hear more about this today and shine a light on what China is doing within the Indo-Pacific region. Whatever the answer to the question about what China's intentions may be, what the world now knows is that Beijing is taking actions to assert or seize effective political control throughout the Indo-Pacific region. It also has escaped no one's attention that the PRC seemingly has adopted a century-old game plan to dominate the Pacific Islands and use them as a platform to expand the Chinese Communist Party's maligned influence. In furtherance of that strategy, China is aggressively threatening political stability in the Pacific Island nations through political warfare and economic coercion. These actions serve to challenge U.S. influence, interests, and values in the region. America has not forgotten the lessons of World War II and the Cold War. The U.S. will not stand idly by in the face of PRC political provocation attacking the sovereignty of our Pacific allies and interference in U.S. Pacific Island territories. America is renewed in our determination to restore a stable international order in the region that respects the integrity of democratic self-government for all island peoples. To that end, we will appreciate any insights on how U.S. engagement will contribute to stability in the region and counter China's maligned influence on our friends and our allies. I want to thank the witnesses that are here, and I look forward to their testimony. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member for any statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses, and my apologies for being a little late. We had to have a moment of silence on the floor of the House today because of the loss of 3 beautiful souls to gun violence and heroic work of our law enforcement officers, 2 who also ended up in the hospital. So my apologies. But there is something about when we think about from places as small and far away as Farmington, New Mexico, to the islands, the freely associated states, that we are all connected with each other and we're all seeking to hold each other together and to look to see how we work together to make sure that we are stronger and to make sure that we can bring peace to our communities and peace to the region in which you spend your time. Today's hearing on preserving U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific will include a good discussion on the compacts of free associations of the United States and the freely associated states of the Federated States of Micronesia and the Republics of Marshall Island and Palau. And yes, we have maintained a special relationship with the Free Associated States for more than 7 decades. Through compacts the Free Association entered into the 1980s, these nations, your nations, allow the U.S. to have military access to the most strategic part of the Northern Pacific between Hawaii and the Philippines. Residents of the freely associated states are not citizens of the United States, but are granted residence and other privileges through their compacts, including the ability to reside and work in the United States and its territories indefinitely as lawful non-immigrants. The initial compacts went into effect in the 1980s and renewed in 2003 for 20 years. They had 3 main goals: end the UN trusteeship for securing full self-government for the islands; 2, continue a close defense relationship; and 3, assist the FSM and the RMI in their efforts to advance economic self-sufficiency. Economic sovereignty is key. With the People's Republic of China's increased presence in the Pacific in recent years, it is a top bipartisan, I believe very bipartisan, strategic priority to renew the financial provisions of the FAS compacts when they expire at the end of fiscal year 2023. In fact, I was in a Rules Committee hearing just last week on the PRC's coercive economic tactics. During the hearing, we heard about the need for collective resilience to more effectively curb bad actors like the PRC. In other words, collective resilience, we need to work together with our allies and our partners. That is how we strengthen our position. But if we let the economic assistance to the freely assisted states end, we run the risk that the PRC will fill the vacuum in the region. So this is a matter of defense, security, and economic opportunity, both for the U.S. and the FAS. Thankfully, the Biden administration's special presidential envoy for compact negotiations has successfully negotiated and secured signed memorandums of understanding with all 3 compact nations to extend financial assistance for an additional 20 years. We expect the parties to sign the final agreements and transmit them to Congress in the coming weeks. Thank you once again, Madam Chair, for holding today's hearing. I look forward to hearing our witnesses explain the need of Congress to swiftly pass the COFA agreements once they are transmitted, and to highlight any issues that we need to learn more about. I'm very much enjoying the educational experience of sitting and listening to such experts on these matters. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now I will introduce our witnesses. Mr. Peter Watson, President and CEO, Dwight Group, LLC, Washington, D.C. Mr. Alexander Gray, Managing Partner, American Global Strategies, LLC, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Mr. Derek Grossman, Senior Defense Analyst, the RAND Corporation, Santa Monica, California. Mr. Emil Freeberg, former Assistant Director and Senior Economist, International Affairs and Trade, Government Accounting Office, Washington, D.C., and Ms. Cleo Pascal, non-resident Senior Fellow, Foundation for Defense of Democracies from Washington, D.C. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone, and we use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute left, the light will turn yellow, and at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses on the panel to testify before member questioning. The chair now recognizes Mr. Watson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hageman, Ranking Member Leger-Fernandez, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you indeed for the privilege and honor of inviting me to visit with you today. My written statement, of course, addresses the interrelated economic, social, and political development challenges that the Pacific Islands have faced in the past and will continue to face as we enter what one hopes will be a new era of deepening engagement by the U.S., Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and indeed other developed democracies of the world in the Pacific Islands region, as represented by the Pacific Islands Forum nations. or PIF, if you wish, as an acronym. The PIF community, of course, includes the Freely Associated States of FSM, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau, and my most recent experience with the Palau Economic Advisory Group informs the narrative of my written statement. My prepared statement also includes an analysis of the critical need for the U.S. national vigilance in protection of the freedom and security of all three U.S. Pacific Island domestic territories, Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa, which I want to spend some time focusing on. The latter, indeed, needing fisheries security enforcement to be urgently prioritized. Of course, as I learned initially during my tour of duty at the National Security Council, where, like Alex, I was responsible for the Pacific Islands, I realized the fullest possible development potential by the Pacific Island community also serves the individual and collective strategic imperatives of the United States and our allies. Accordingly, to understand how the COFA for the FSM, RMI, and Palau became successfully included in this complex partnership, it's axiomatic that every president since Truman and every U.S. Congress since 1946 has acted consistent with one overarching and immutable principle. It has been the strategic denial of the islands now comprised by the FSM, RMI, and Palau to the military forces of any nation, unless by agreement of the United States, and that's unsurpassed by any other strategic imperative in U.S. relations with those islands. From 1947 to 1986, as we all know, the U.S. administration of these islands was pursuant to the decision of the President and Congress to reject annexation and to place the islands in the U.S. trusteeship system. The trusteeship agreement expressly provided for the U.S. to combine international standards of self-determination and application of the same of domestic laws Congress applied in the U.S. territories, including nearby Guam. It was during the 4 decades of the trusteeship that the U.S. encouraged the peoples, also traditional and elected leaders, to embrace a standard of living that includes, for example, social, political, and economic reliance on dependable and safe modern commercial civil aviation, possible through the same FAA en route aviation safety control safety system provided in the U.S. state and territories, which continues under COFA. The same was true of the U.S. Postal Services, the U.S. Department of Education scholarship and early childhood education programs, U.S. Weather Services, a combination of FEMA and USAID disaster relief programs, FDIC, and over a dozen other federal programs and services otherwise only provided in U.S. states and territories. Again, the U.S. actively encouraged this dependence during the trusteeship when the islands played a crucial and irreplaceable role in America's arms race with the USSR and the success of nuclear deterrence strategy that prevented nuclear war for decades. And the return on U.S. investment in these islands during the Cold War and trusteeship was matched under COFA by the benefits to America during the War on Terror of the missile defense system that could not have been otherwise developed without COFA. In close, Madam Chairman, as we now face PRC competition and threats that come with it, the COFA nations and our territories are even more vital than ever to America's strategic repositioning. In addition to the strategic denial and basing and operating rights from Kwajalein to Angkor, the citizens of the freely associated states serve under COFA in the armed forces in the United States at a higher rate than most states in the same uniform and battles as our fellow Americans, as do the U.S. territories, especially American Samoa. Thank you, Madam Chairman. These points are not the end of discussion, and we'll have about the COFA in the months ahead, but it's part of the beginning of that discussion, and I thank you for giving me and my colleagues the opportunity of sharing these thoughts with you today.
Thank you, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Gray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hageman and Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez and members of the committee for this opportunity to testify today on a matter of tremendous importance for the sovereignty and integrity of U.S. Pacific territories and insular areas, and that's countering the malign influence of the People's Republic of China. As the first ever Director for Oceania and Indo-Pacific Security at the NSC from 2018 to 2019, I witnessed firsthand the PRC's growing influence across the Pacific, including in U.S. territories and insular areas. While PRC ambitions have received considerable media coverage and high-level official attention in places like the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, there's been an alarming dearth of focus on Beijing's efforts to penetrate, influence, and subvert U.S. territories for which our government is directly responsible. While the United States has an extraordinary strategic interest in the integrity of the freely associated states, I'm going to focus my attention in this testimony primarily on U.S. territories. In addition to the obligation the U.S. government has to the integrity of these areas, they are strategically significant as the U.S. embarks on prolonged competition with the PRC. The territories of Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands are in vital sea lanes. They host critical military infrastructure and assets, and they are integral parts of the Indo-Pacific economy. Additionally, the U.S. administers 9 Pacific possessions, including Wake Island, Midway Atoll, and others, likely to play important roles in that evolving U.S. PRC competition. The strategic reality in the region has made U.S. territories and possessions in the Pacific a prime target for PRC malign influence. As others have noted, this influence can come in many forms: propaganda, traditional espionage, influence operations targeted at elites, but also general public opinion, and more. U.S. Pacific territories have witnessed the full spectrum of PRC operations, but given their anomalous status within the U.S. government and quirks of how the executive branch is organized, they failed to receive the attention and the resources to appropriately address the predations of the PRC. In my written testimony, I've laid out the various specific ways the PRC is exerting malign influence against U.S. territories in the Pacific. But I think, just to encapsulate that, Washington needs to begin prioritizing the defense of U.S. Pacific territories and possessions the same way we would address those same actions against a U.S. state. To increase the responsiveness of senior levels of the U.S. government to the threats facing our Pacific territories and possessions, it is time for the National Security Council to establish an interagency policy process chaired at the Assistant Secretary level by an appropriate NSC official to respond to threats to U.S. territories and to integrate this response into our larger national security strategy. This process would need representation from across the U.S. government. Just as a few specific examples of steps the government could and should take, we need to establish a director-level position at the National Security Council focused on the U.S. territories and possessions who can provide staff support to that policy process that I just mentioned. The Coast Guard is the entity most capable of defending and safeguarding U.S. sovereignty in the U.S. territories and possessions. They need additional resources to undertake that mission, including, I would add, continuing forward with the process of evaluating a permanent Coast Guard station in American Samoa. Additional bureaucratic fixes can be made to strengthen the hand of the U.S. government in countering PRC malign activity in the region. That could include opening additional FBI field offices outside of Honolulu in our U.S. territories and possessions. It also means taking the PRC's economic assault on our Pacific territories more seriously and integrating efforts by departments of commerce, treasury, and labor into a larger policy process to address challenges like what has happened to the cannery in American Samoa, which is a direct result of the PRC's economic coercion. Finally, U.S. territories and possessions in the Pacific are vital sovereign parts of the United States, and and they're going to be instrumental in the conduct of our long-term competition with the PRC. In addition to the strategic rationale, we owe it to the Americans who call these islands home to structure the U.S. government appropriately, apply the appropriate attention and focus to safeguarding them from malign interference and influence. The bureaucratic fixes I've outlined are just a beginning baseline for that process as we continue to reconfigure ourselves for the era of great power competition. Thank you again.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Grossman for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chair Hageman, Ranking Member Legier-Fernandez, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Beijing is pursuing 3 interrelated objectives in the Pacific, which include eliminating Taiwan's diplomatic space, accessing natural resources and generating economic activity, and breaking through the U.S. military's domination of the second island chain. China's strategy toward the Pacific Island countries is also playing out in the FAS, a region of keen geostrategic interest to the United States. As my RAND colleagues and I discussed in a 2019 report to Congress, the FAS are critical enablers of U.S. military operations that support the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy. Marshall Islands is one of the 4 nations in Oceania that diplomatically recognizes Taiwan over China. Because it has limited influence over the Marshall Islands, Beijing may be attempting to find ways to covertly secure its economic interests there. For example, 2 Chinese nationals who have also become naturalized Marshallese citizens conspired to establish the Rongelap Atoll Special Administrative Region within Marshall Islands, potentially giving Beijing access to natural resources and fishing in the future. Rongelap is also near the U.S. Ronald Reagan Missile Defense Test Site on Kwajalein Atoll, potentially raising spying concerns. The Federated States of Micronesia is the only state within the FAS that diplomatically recognizes China over Taiwan. As a result, Chinese contacts with state governments and state officials are numerous. In 2014, the 2 nations created the Commission on Economic Trade Cooperation. China's economic relationship with FSM includes substantial trade and aid components. Additionally, the FSM is a participant in China's global infrastructure and investment program known as Belt and Road Initiative. Like Marshall Islands, Palau also recognizes Taiwan over China, which has made it a target of Chinese pressure. Most notably, Chinese tourism to Palau ramped up for years until suddenly in November 2017, Beijing barred tourists from traveling to this pristine vacation spot. It appears that Beijing's move was in retaliation for Palau's refusal to switch diplomatic recognition. And because the South China Sea is now practically devoid of fishery resources, Chinese fishermen are going farther afield in search of these resources, including within Palau's exclusive economic zone. This is causing new security concerns. For example, in December of 2020, with the assistance of the U.S. Coast Guard, Palauan authorities discovered 28 Chinese fishermen poaching sea creatures within its EEZ, and Palau deported them. Although they do not face diplomatic pressure from China because they are U.S. territories, American Samoa, Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, as well as Guam, nonetheless are dealing with a variety of Chinese economic and security threats. For American Samoa, Chinese illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing activities have depleted tuna stocks within its EEZ and disrupted the local economy, even to the point of forcing a tuna cannery there, which is one of the island's largest employers, to temporarily suspend operations due to a lack of tuna availability. The Biden administration has been considering a Trump-era plan to station a U.S. Coast Guard cutter in American Samoa, in part to deter and intercept Chinese IUU fishing activities. CNMI primarily faces a potential economic threat from China as well, due to the fact that CNMI's economy is highly dependent on tourism coming from China. As we have seen with Palau and countries outside of Oceania, it's quite easy for Beijing to exact retaliation against those it harbors disagreements with by ending Chinese tourism to these destinations. And for Guam, the primary Chinese threat is military in nature. Because Guam is home to U.S. Navy, Air Force, and as of January, a Marine Corps base, the island has become an attractive target for China to disrupt or disable in the run-up to or during military operations against Taiwan or in the East or South China Sea. Indeed, Chinese social media has referred to its military's DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile as the quote-unquote Guam killer missile. Meanwhile, in April of this year, China also sent a carrier group featuring a Shandong aircraft carrier into waters approximately 400 miles off the coast of Guam. I have many recommendations detailed in my written statement, but in the interest of time, here are three. First, consider Pacific-focused policy. Second, offer economic assistance to U.S. territories particularly susceptible to Chinese economic coercion. And third, provide additional maritime domain awareness and patrol capabilities to FAS and U.S. territories. Thanks again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Freeberg for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chair, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Emil Freeberg. I am affiliated with Georgetown University. In 2021, I retired from the GAO, where I supported Compactor Free Association reviews, many of them for this committee. The views I share today are my own. I want to highlight two things: the structure of the compacts and strategies to deepen COFA and U.S. ties. Turning to structure, the compacts are based on three pillars. First compact pillar, defense rights and obligations. Benefits to the United States include strategic denial, defense veto, U.S. defense sites, including at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands and new sites in Palau. COFA nations benefit from United States defense guarantees. COFA citizens join the U.S. military, a contribution to COFA defense, and a benefit to the United States. Second compact pillar is economic assistance. U.S. grants support about 1/3 of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands government budgets, and about 14% of Palau's budget. Many federal agencies operate in the COFA nations when Congress has extended programs, essentially treating them as if they were a U.S. state or territory. Examples include U.S. Postal and Weather Services, FAA airport programs, public health, Pell Grants to students, and USDA home loans to households and families. The third compact pillar is immigration. Migration benefits COFA families, giving them access to U.S. opportunities. Migration also benefits U.S. employers, some of whom recruit workers directly from COFA nations. These three compact pillars are linked together. U.S. defense rights are secured with economic assistance to COFA governments and benefits to COFA families. In conjunction with the U.S. state of Hawaii and the U.S. territories of Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, the COFA nations secure the North Pacific for the United States. Now I will outline 4 strategies to deepen COFA and U.S. ties. The first strategy is maintain and extend U.S. programs to COFA nations. Congress should maintain current grants to COFA nations and provide eligibility for any new federal programs as if they were a U.S. state or territory. For example, the CARES Act extended pandemic unemployment assistance eligibility to workers in COFA nations and COFA workers in the United States. A second strategy, improve COFA migrant status to equal that of green card holders. Today, the status is unequal and sometimes confusing. Providing COFA migrants with the equivalent of permanent resident or green card status would treat COFA migrants as equal to other lawful permanent residents with respect to federal program eligibility and provide a pathway for naturalization. Third strategy is invest in hands-on federal engagement in the COFA nations. I have 3 examples. Reestablish the Department of Defense Civic Action Team program in the FSM and the RMI to upgrade infrastructure and to heighten our security presence. Restore Peace Corps programs in all 3 compact nations. Establish access to VA benefits and health care for COFA nation military veterans. And lastly, the 4th strategy is maintain congressional engagement. Congress can assure that U.S. programs deliver results with accountability and that U.S. efforts are properly resourced. Congress can assess U.S. policy and operational coordination across the 3 compact pillars, defense, economic assistance, and migration. Finally, I would advocate that Congress reinstate the periodic GAO review mandate to support congressional monitoring of any renewed compact assistance. In closing, the most significant action to deepen bilateral ties is congressional approval of compact renewal. I wish to thank the subcommittee for this opportunity to speak, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
I thank the witness for their testimony, and the chair now recognizes Ms. Pascal for 5 minutes.
Chair Hagman, Ranking Member Leger Fernandez, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the daunting honor of being invited to testify today. I'm going to explain why the FAS are important to China, what Beijing is doing to try to turn them into vassal states, and how the U.S. can help the FAS defend themselves. Why are the FAS important to China? Well, because they're really important to the United States. The U.S. relationship with the FAS, as we've heard, is multidimensional and complex. China has some interests in many of the dimensions, but there's one above all that makes them a very high priority for Beijing, and that's geography. We often hear about the strategic importance of the first island chain. That's the chain of islands that runs roughly north-south off the coast of Asia, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia. It hems in China's vast and growing military. Much of America's defense strategy in the Pacific is reinforcing that so-called castle wall. The implicit assumption is the PLA will come pouring off the coast of China and hit the chain. That's the strategy, but as the saying goes, amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. And the logistical reality is that this really gets a lot harder, if not impossible, without the east-west chain of islands. America's Pacific Islands and the FAS create a corridor of freedom that includes freedom of deployment from Hawaii to the waters of treaty allies Philippines and Japan, and through them onto Taiwan. Continued access is the unspoken assumption that underpins the castle wall approach. Through their COFAs with the United States, the FAS have voluntarily granted the United States, as we've heard, uniquely extensive defense and security access to their sovereign territories. The U.S. takes these extraordinary agreements for granted. It shouldn't. As I've heard Dr. Watson say, the word free isn't freely associated. China can read a map as well and has been working hard and smart to change the strategic geography. It's been expanding its reach by building and militarizing islands between its coast and first island chain in the South China Sea. That pushes it closer to that first island chain and aids in its deployment. It's also one of the reasons why Beijing is so keen on taking Taiwan. It blows a hole in the chain. But taking Taiwan isn't China's endpoint. Once it takes Taiwan, China needs to secure it. That means the security perimeter is centered on Taiwan and then goes out from there, which means the FAS and other Pacific Island leaders. Other Pacific Islands leaders in the FAS know it. In 2022, Micronesian President David Penuelo wrote that China's intention was, quote, shifting us very close into Beijing's orbit, intrinsically tying the whole of our economies and societies to them. The people of the region also know it. When, as was mentioned, China media talks about a Guam killer missile, the people of Guam, Americans, know that means killing them. Imagine if Chinese media was talking about Wyoming killer missiles, for example. China would prefer to take Taiwan through political warfare than by force. Also, China would prefer to take the FAS the same way. So how is China trying to use political warfare to undermine the U.S. and the FAS? It's attacking the institutions of state and democracy itself in a form of entropic warfare, as the chair mentioned, that creates social and political fragmentation and weakens resistance. Here are some examples from each of the FAS. Dr. Grossman mentioned Rongelap, and the Chinese Marshallese couple that tried to essentially create, according to U.S. government indictment, the intention of establishing a semi-autonomous region akin to Hong Kong within the country. That has now gone to trial. That attempt came within one vote of succeeding in the Marshall Islands Parliament. The couple involved pled guilty, and a few weeks ago, the United States deported one of the criminals back to the Marshall Islands, where she's free to establish her linkages with local elites, some of whom will be running in the upcoming election. The second sentencing was today, and he's also likely to be deported back to the Marshall Islands. There are similar concerns about Chinese money and criminal activity affecting the upcoming elections in Palau, another country that recognizes Taiwan. Palau has deported hundreds of Chinese criminals and has since identified many more that it doesn't have the capacity to expel. U.S.-sanctioned major triad figure Broken Tooth was operating from Palau. In Micronesia, the former president wrote about China, quote, "We are bribed to be complicit and bribed to be silent. The practical impact of this is that some senior members and elected officials take actions that are contrary to FSM's national interests but are consistent with the PRC's national interests." Each of the FAS is one election away from being lost to the free world. From a narrow strategic lens, that means that in the same way the loss of Taiwan blows a hole in the north-south chain, this blows a hole in the east-west chain. With the U.S. looking at the edge of the Pacific and focusing on the Chinese coast, China is looking at replicating American World War II island-hopping campaign, but using political warfare to embed and conquer. The goal? In 2008, Admiral Keating told Sask that a senior Chinese officer suggested to him, quote, "Why don't we reach an agreement, you and I, you take Hawaii east, we'll take Hawaii west, we'll share information, and we'll save you all the trouble of deploying your forces west of Hawaii." China's actions make it look like that wasn't said in jest. This has the potential to change the security dynamic of the Pacific in the most fundamental way we've seen since the end of World War II. The honest leaders of the region know it and are trying to tell us for the sake of their people and for the sake of America. We owe it to them and to those who died the last time around to listen. In my written testimony, I make several recommendations about how to do that. Thank you.
I thank the witness for their testimony, and the chair will now recognize Chairman Westerman for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Hageman, and also thank you to the witnesses for being here today as we convene today to take testimony from expert witnesses on the preservation of U.S. critical interest in the Pacific Islands and more broadly the Indo-Pacific region. Today's hearing will focus on regional outcomes that impact the well-being of our fellow Americans living in our nation's domestic island territories located in the increasingly contested geopolitical region of the Pacific. The record we create today will support the mission and work of this committee to ensure that U.S. citizens in our locally self-governing U.S. territories of American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands benefit and prosper under the American model of democracy, market-driven economics, responsible environmental stewardship, and of course, strong national defense. The U.S. also has sovereignty and responsibility for outposts in the Pacific that includes Jarvis, Howland, Baker, Wake, Midway, Johnston, and Palmyra Islands. We need to remember that those U.S. lands in the Pacific, including the then U.S. territories of Hawaii and the Philippines, were directly attacked and in some cases occupied by an aspiring imperialist dictatorship attempting to conquer the Pacific. 100,000 Americans died freeing the Pacific Islands from brutality and tyranny in World War II. Their sacrifices highlight why it is a strategic imperative to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. At the international level, the U.S. maintains an unprecedented political and economic partnership, as well as a strategically imperative security and defense alliance with 3 sovereign Pacific Island democracies through the Compacts of Free Association. These 3 countries are the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau, and are also known as Freely Associated States, or FAS. Under their individual compact agreements, the Freely Associated States accepted and through their constitutional processes ratified mutually agreed terms for entering into free association with the United States. The U.S. relationship with the FAS is the closest political, economic, and strategic relationship the U.S. has with any other nation or group of nations. At this moment, the compact agreements with the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau are being negotiated for renewal by the Biden administration. In future hearings, this committee anticipates addressing compact renewal, including any agreements reached with the freely associated states and sent to Congress by the President. This is a top priority given the importance of the U.S.-FAS relationships. It is through regional, strategic, and mutual security agreements like the Compacts of Free Association that the U.S. can exercise peace through strength with our allies to counter increasing global threats. The greatest threat to global peace, prosperity, and freedom is the communist regime in the People's Republic of China. To be clear, this committee recognizes the distinction between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. Thus, when this committee refers to China and the threat it poses, it is referring to the Chinese government and its Communist Party. In the present day, China does not hesitate to engage opportunistically in its trademark disruption and usurpation tactics targeting any nation over which it gains influence or control. This committee is deeply troubled that China has for at least a decade targeted the FAS. China has even targeted our American territories. Beijing has employed tactics aimed at disruption of political order and social cohesion. The threat that China poses to the United States and to the world cannot be overstated. We must fully understand the extent of China's activities in the FAS and U.S. territories and how engagement in the Pacific deters Chinese influence. Thus, I hope our witnesses today can give us frank assessments of U.S. interest in the Pacific and how China is working to undermine those threats and use the Pacific Islands as a platform for an enlarged threat of unrestrained aggression in the region and beyond. And as chairman of the committee, I'm committed to working across the aisle. Ranking Member Grijalva and I have both talked about the importance of working together to make sure that we do what's best for the territories we talked about, and also for those freely associated states, and what's best for America and, quite frankly, for the world going forward. So this is very important. I appreciate the engagement today, and I look forward to questions. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair will now recognize the members for 5 minutes for questions, beginning with me. Mr. Derek Grossman, I'm going to direct my first questions to you. In your statement, your first recommendation for Congress and the U.S. government is to ensure funding for the renewed compacts of free association. The compacts are unique in the U.S. and provides the FAS with substantial economic assistance and access to federal programs and services. Do you think China is prepared to make the same or a comparable level of long-term economic commitments to the FAS in order to replace the U.S. as a partner of choice? Or do you believe the PRC intends to achieve its goals solely through less costly, short-term, opportunistic engagement that includes tactics of disruption and political warfare?
Thank you for that question. So, of course, it's difficult to know how China would react to having a geostrategic void, so to speak, if we could not come to a COFA renewal agreement. But what we have seen in the past is that Chinese officials have consistently tried to offer better deals to countries that feel caught up in intensifying U.S.-China competition. And this can take the form of, improved trading opportunities, as well as through Belt and Road Initiative that I mentioned in my opening remarks. But at the same time, we shouldn't think that if we were unable to renew the COFAs, that China would necessarily come in and give, equal or more in yearly economic assistance to the freely associated states. I'm not sure that is something that we can determine at this time, but I do know, I'm pretty confident that they would try to offer at least something that would make us, feel like we didn't do the right thing.
In your testimony about China's strategy towards the Pacific Islands, you mentioned that one of China's top 3 priorities for the region is breaking through U.S. military domination of the second island chain. Can you explain the territories and FAS's strategic location within this island chain and what capabilities or opportunities this location provides the U.S.?
Yeah, so I think when China looks out at the region, they see concentric circles hemming them in. First island chain, second island chain. Some say the third island chain is, Hawaii and the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, right? And but when we look at it, we say this is great because we have points of power projection so we can project military power from these regions into the theater, into the Indo-Pacific to deal with Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea, or even a Korea scenario. And so China is trying its best to try to loosen the screws on U.S. alliances and partnerships throughout the entire region, but also to include in the second island chain. The reason why the geography is so important is because, my RAND colleagues and I said this back in the 2019 report that I referenced to Congress, is it essentially provides having uninhibited access to a region that's the size of CONUS, literally from Palau to Marshall Islands is the size of CONUS. To have that is like a power projection superhighway from Hawaii into the Pacific, right? So China wants to complicate our ability to flow forces into the region for future contingency.
Thank you. Mr. Gray, you were the first director for Oceania and Indo-Pacific Security at the NSC. While President Biden has retained a region-specific team within the NSC, you have some recommendations about how to increase responsiveness of the senior levels of government and integrate responses into the national security strategy. To your knowledge, has the model that was stood up under the Trump administration been maintained under the current administration?
Well, thank you for the question, Chair. So my understanding is that the position that I occupied at the NSC is no longer entirely devoted to the Pacific Islands, that it has reverted to covering Southeast Asia as well as the Pacific Islands. Now, that is to say, I do think that there's been some excellent focus on the Pacific by this current NSC staff, but I do think there is value in having a director who is entirely focused on the Pacific Islands. And as I said in my written testimony, I think there should be a director who's also entirely focused on our territories and possessions. Personnel is policy, and if you don't have someone who is day-to-day focused in these areas, you will have neglect.
Wonderful, thank you for that. I yield back, and the chair now recognizes the ranking minority member, Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for the testimony to all of our witnesses today. You know, it strikes me as I both read your testimony and listened to you today that we all agree kind of on this common theme of the need to support this region, the freely associated states, each of these islands, but that is also an issue of mutual benefit. And we have to live up to our part of the bargain in a certain sense. And that we need to be able to understand what is actually happening within the islands and what's important and the role that China is playing, whether it's from belts and roads to interfering with elections. And those issues around interfering with the elections are stuff that we see here as well, right? But it's unusual and different, and we need to have a perspective that is tied to the uniqueness of the islands. So I want to touch base on a few of the points that were raised. Both Ms. Pascal and Dr. Freeberg, you raised issues with regards to the issue of climate, the climate crisis, and the issues of that there isn't FEMA authority, and what do we do with emergencies? And if we do not pay attention to that crucial piece, that is a threat to everybody, but the islands are most susceptible. Could you sort of maybe each of you talk a bit about what we should be doing different and what that would mean in terms of how the people on the ground feel about it in each of these places?
Okay, thank you for that question. And I have a few comments about this in the written statement, but let me just sort of discuss the climate issue a little bit, because I think for the three COFA nations, they do view this as one of their major security issues, is their survivability and the ability of their fisheries to succeed and to be able to have fresh water and access to land for farming, et cetera. One of the ways, for example, I propose that if DOD restores the civic action team is that their functionality can be partly to support infrastructure, which is sort of pro-climate, remediation and adaptation, as well as supporting DOD's efforts to have agile deployment, for example. So this may be work at ports, seawalls, other kinds of infrastructure. But this is an area, I think, that is of really great interest to the COFA nations. I think the other thing is that the FEMA funding for USAID activities in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands will end at the end of this fiscal year. And so they would revert to being able to be recipients of USAID traditional assistance around the world, but not sort of the substantial assistance that comes from a FEMA engagement. And so that, again, is one of the things which is really on the table at this point with the expiration of economic assistance under the compacts. I'll turn to my colleague.
How's that? Yay.
unfortunately now you can hear me. It's still one of the things that's top of mind for many of the people. I know the compacts is a little bit better than the territories. And it goes to this bigger issue of, they're not actually, they mostly don't want to just wait for us to come and save them, right? So it's giving them the tools to be able to protect themselves and to be a part of the decision-making process. So there are proposals, for example, for think tanks to be developed so that you don't have these climate experts who fly in and then tell them you need this or you need that. And in many cases, land issues are extremely complex in the islands, and the locals know it much better than anybody else. So working with local knowledge in the areas is essential, but similarly in terms of civil defense, there's a lot of retired U.S. military personnel, as was referenced. They serve in the U.S. military at rates that are higher than almost any U.S. state, as far as I know, and then they go back home. So they have the ability to coordinate and to respond well in times of crisis, but they don't have the infrastructure to loop them together so that they can, and they're out in the villages and they can be here. So those sort of just linking mechanisms that give them the tools to solve their own problems in a way that works for them currently is missing. I think there's a piece of legislation that's going to be proposed that may help with that. And I think that with HADR, but with many other areas, would be extremely important.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired, but we might send out some additional questions because I think that the issues that you are raising and the fact that we have an opportunity to get it right and not lose this opportunity, as many of your written testimonies pointed out that we've done in the past. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative Radewag.
Talofa lava, Madam Chair, Hageman, and Ranking Member Ledger Fernandez. Thank you for this hearing, which comes just as we're waiting to see if the administration finally signs and sends to Congress the COFA renewal agreements. So I wish to begin my time with seeking unanimous consent to enter into the record President David Panuelo's letter that has been mentioned throughout the testimony. Congress will exercise its oversight and approval process of these agreements over the next year, and I hope we're not penny wise and pound foolish in funding them ASAP to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific. Protecting our national interests in American Samoa and the Pacific region has been among my main reasons for being in Congress, and this moment has been a long time coming. I especially want to echo Ms. Pascal's comments on moving away from maritime domain awareness to maritime domain enforcement, which is why I've long been an advocate for additional Coast Guard assets to be present in the South Pacific. One example of how we change and manage U.S. engagement in the Pacific relates to the strategic, economic, and commercial issue of protecting American fisheries industry and rights in the region, particularly our tuna industry. I couldn't agree more with the testimony of Dr. Peter Watson that the economy, future, and fate of American Samoa and the U.S. purseine fleet are inextricably linked to one another. In fact, I appreciate Dr. Watson's appearance. He has a distinguished career in the Asia-Pacific region, but an especially long history with the Pacific Islands, and was the White House lead staff member on President George H.W. Bush's team in organizing the very first Pacific Island Leaders Summit. I was grateful to be invited to participate in that summit in 1990. He also arranged for 5 heads of government, as I recall, to have visits with the president, which I believe is a record. So, Dr. Watson, my dear Dr. Watson, I would like to ask you how current or future proposals to further limit commercial fishing activities in outlying areas within the U.S. EEZ might negatively impact the Pacific territories, particularly American Samoa, if further fishing restrictions are imposed on the American fleet.
Thank you very much for those warm comments, Congresswoman. I'm very concerned about the degradation of the U.S. tuna fishing capabilities, and as it particularly affects American Samoa. The fact is that the United States is a member of the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, a treaty-based organization that manages the international fisheries throughout the region. The WCPFC conservation measure for tropical tunas establishes a limit for the United States purse seine fleet of 1,270 fishing days on the high seas and a separate limit of 558 days for the U.S. Economic Exclusive Zone, or EEZ. Now, historically, the United States has informed the WCPFC that it will implement these two limits as a single combined limit of 1,828 fishing days, which can be fished by the fleet either on the high seas in the U.S. EEZ. With most of the EEZ, however, closed for fishing, most of this effort has been fished on the high seas. Because some of the WCPFC members have complained about this, NOAA has got weak kneed and is proposing to split the single combined limit into two separate limits. I'm sure all can see the irony in the government saying, we're going to take your 558 days and no longer allow them to be fished on the high seas, but only in the U.S. EEZ. And oh, by the way, we're closing the remaining waters of the U.S. EEZ. Sorry. This is unacceptable. The Pacific fleets that are operating in and around American Samoa are a strategic asset, as well as, of course, an important driver of income within American Samoa. I'd like to come back to this point if I could, there's additional time.
I think I'm out of time now, aren't I?
Thank you. Yes, the Chauna recognizes Mr. Sablan for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon and welcome to our witnesses. It's nice to see you again, Dr. Freeberg. I'm sorry we missed our lunch date in Palau, but thank you for taking care of Brian and Ken. Appreciate that. Mr. Gray, I usually don't do this, but I'll make an exception here, sir, special guy. But I want to clear up some misconceptions about birth tourism, please, that you raise in your testimony, because you are giving my district, we already have a little black eye, a bit of a bigger black eye, if I may. You state that, quote, in recent years, foreign births in the Marianas have exceeded native ones, correct?
That was the information that I had been given during my service at the White House.
Okay, but, wow, because here it is 2022. I do not seem to get what you mean by recent years. But in fact, foreign births in the Marianas have not exceeded resident births since 2018. And even before the pandemic, tourist births were going down. And last year, only 3 tourists gave birth in the Marianas, 2 from China, 1 from Korea, South Korea. Madam Chair, I ask that this report of live births by mother's resident status from the Vital Statistics Office of the Commonwealth Healthcare Corporation be added to the record, please.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chair, for context, may I also add to the record this report by the Center for Immigration Studies on birth tourism in the United States as a whole. There may be 26,000 birth tourists annually, the center says, and they enter our country under tourist visa. I think it is important for members to understand the Marianas is not the source of birth tourism problem. The report of live births in the Marianas does indeed reveal a deep problem, a real problem, however, the huge drop in births among U.S. population. In 2010, there were 670 births to residents of the Marianas. In 2022, that number was down to 388, a 42% decline in births. That declining birth rate mirrors the overall population decline in the Marianas as measured by our decennial census. We lost 12.2% of our population in that 10-year period, the second largest decrease of any U.S. state or territory. And that population drop is why I introduced the Marianas Population Stabilization Act, H.R. 560. And I hope, Madam Chair, the subcommittee will act on my legislation to shore up the larger U.S. position in the Western Pacific. Mr. Gray, you were with the White House National Security Staff during
I was.
Trump administration. And you share my concern, and I'm sure concern of other members of this committee about the expanding influence of China in the Western Pacific. Yes?
Absolutely.
Be with you, sir. Yet, I don't think it strengthens America's position in the region if our population there is shrinking. People usually move away from their homes when they see better opportunities elsewhere. People move to improve their quality of life, to get a better education for their children, for better infrastructure, to earn more money. I can't stop them from moving. So, as a national security expert, Mr. Gray, you would agree it hurts America's position in the Western Pacific vis-a-vis China if people are leaving the Marianas for a better life elsewhere. Would you say?
Congressman, I think the most important thing, as far as my perspective on the Pacific, is that CNMI continue to have a strong social cohesion and to have an economy that can continue to sustain itself for years to come. That's my concern.
And with that, sir, I cannot agree with you more. We are hurting now really bad, and the federal government continues to take that back. We are a part of the United States, a permanent part of the United States, because we chose to be. Nobody forced us. By referendum, we chose to be. We're not, other parts of the United Insular areas. And just like I must say, I'm hearing all our witnesses, the smart ones too, let me say this, that none of the three COFA nations, the Federated States of Micronesia, who just, I understand, finalized agreements with the United States, and I'm very happy for that, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. All of these three island nations have the choice to negotiate with someone else, and yet they are here negotiating with us. And the very least we can do, again, Madam Chair, please, all of us as Americans in our own better national interest, let's not wait another 10 years or 8 years and we go over passport fees to fund this Compact of Impact associations. We have to get serious. And I'm glad that Chairman Westerman's comments that he's going to give this every priority. I thank all of you. My time is over, Madam Chair. I apologize and thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lamalfa for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my colleague. Mr. Gray, I referred to a Real Clear Defense article and a quote you had made on that not since 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis has a foreign power such as China posed such a direct military threat in close proximity to the U.S. mainland, and where that affects our various island partners as well too. So how do we make the case to mainland Americans more strongly that they should care about this issue as we do, and what real tangible threats is China's extremely aggressive presence in the South Pacific posing to our friends in the islands as well as here in the U.S., especially with our communications, et cetera?
Well, I appreciate that, Congressman. And, to Congressman Sablan's point, I think that, this is as much as a strategic issue, this is a moral issue. This is a question of Americans on the mainland and throughout the United States we need to stand in solidarity with our nationals and our citizens, whether they live CNMI or Guam or American Samoa as much as in Oklahoma or Texas or Florida. And I think there's a moral issue here, and then there's the strategic issue. And the strategic issue is if you're trying to project American power, but just as important as project American power, if you're trying to deter Chinese projection of power farther into the Pacific, being able to deny access to these critical localities, that's essential. And I would point out, and this is something that was shared with me by a very senior Australian official when I was in government, if you superimpose a map of Imperial Japan's efforts to get military bases in 1940 over where the Chinese military has been publicly reported to be seeking bases, it's almost identical. So you can see the historical pattern replaying itself because the geography is immutable. The geography hasn't changed. And so I think we need to be mindful that this isn't just a question of defense. This is a question of China's interest in playing offense, and we need to be very mindful of that.
But how much is that interfering with our ability here on the mainland just to do normal business?
Well, it has a tremendous potential to interfere with everything from trade, commerce, supply chain issues. In a world in which China is projecting power well into the second island chain and beyond, that is not a world that is familiar to any American who's lived since 1945. We take for granted our ability to control the Western Pacific, to project power into East Asia. A world in which China is denying us that capability is a very, very different economic and geopolitical world.
Thank you. Mr. Grossman, with the Chinese Communist Party basically infringing on this economic zone and the maritime space in the area, how much is that affecting the fishing we have in that area and the overall economic activity for our partners down there?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. And as I mentioned in my remarks, as well as in my written statement, this is a pretty significant shift in the fishing throughout the Indo-Pacific and frankly globally. The South China Sea, which we haven't talked about as much here today, is practically devoid of fishing resources due to the destruction of coral reef environments in which the fish breed, pollution, overfishing, and climate change, among other factors. And so Chinese IUU fleets, they're referred to as deep sea fleets, are kind of fanning out across the globe in search of new fishery resources to include within the second island chain area.
Let's emphasize that there. So what has the response been from international partners, UN or different groups, non-government organizations, to hit on this deliberate depletion, a very aggressive one by China, since they don't seem to follow any treaties or others on fishing appropriately as many other countries do? What are you seeing as a response and the effort to hold China accountable?
Well, the United Nations certainly is tracking the issue. They meet on the issue in different, smaller committee settings. But again, IUU, the very definition of it being illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, means that China is doing this stuff, below board, essentially. And so the question is, how do you stop them from doing it? And one of the recommendations from my colleague, Mr. Gray, and I share this sentiment as well, is that we need to do more in terms of U.S. Coast Guard deployment to the region to patrol and monitor these activities.
In our island areas as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry about the time.
Thank you.
Bouncing back and forth between committees. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Congressman Case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hope we can all stipulate at this point that the PRC is actively, consciously, and very deliberately expanding its influence across not just the compact countries, but the entire Pacific, all of the jurisdictions of the Pacific, and that its intentions are not to foster an international rules-based order
or to enhance a free and open Indo-Pacific, or to support commonly shared values or any of the other ties that bind. So great testimony, everybody. I think we're beyond that. And now, how do we deal with it? Mr. Freeberg, and by the way, before I go on to Mr. Freeberg, I just want to put a point on my colleague Ms. Radewagen's reference to the letter from former Federated States of Micronesia President David Panuelo, who I don't know if any of you actually did reference it. I think you did, but it deserves a little bit more attention. A 13-page, highly itemized description of how China tries to subvert an entire government. If you want to find out what China is actually doing in the countries of the Pacific and around the globe, for that matter, please read Mr. President Panuelo's letter. Really commend it to any of you. I think that settles the case in terms of strategy and tactics and approach. So Mr. Freeberg, you, first of all, great testimony. I loved your just nice, tight summary of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what we need to do. I agreed with virtually everything you said, from defense to economic to immigration. All of that is true, but you know as well as I do that there's an impact from the immigration side of the compacts to many jurisdictions in this country, with a particularly severe impact from the compact residents who are legally in our country, but who are not getting the benefit of federal services, not getting the benefit of impact assistance in any appreciable form, and that this is a critical obstacle to those jurisdictions supporting a renewed compact. I say this for myself, straight out. I support the compacts. I support their renegotiation. I think they're critical to our national security. But I cannot accept the consequences to Hawaii, or for that matter to Guam, to the CNMI, to Arkansas, to Washington, to Oregon, to California, to other jurisdictions, of the obligation of hosting compact migrants with particular needs in economic, healthcare, social services, education, in some cases public safety. You used to work for the Government Accountability Office, and you, I think you said in your introduction, you authored some 40 reports on the compact countries over a span of 20 years, but you authored one that was particularly instructive, which was the report, Populations in U.S. Areas Have Grown with Varying Reported Effects, which is essentially an analysis of compact impact, resident impacts, unreimbursed resident impacts. And I would ask unanimous consent that this report be included in the record, Madam Chair.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I'm going to cite your number one conclusion, at least the one that reaches out to me. The top three jurisdictions with large compact populations, Hawaii, Guam, and the CNMI, had $1.8 billion in compact impact consequence. In other words, the services provided to the compact residents between 2014 and, 2004 and 2018, I think it was, with $500 million reimbursed. That is not adequate reimbursement. So what are the remaining steps to be taken to adequately compensate Hawaii and other jurisdictions for the impact of the migrants and support the compacts in the process?
Thank you. That's a big question, and I would note that I don't really author GAO reports. I help a team that prepares them, so I have many colleagues that are behind all of this good work. I would say, thinking about the compact impact, this was an issue which arose in the mid-'80s when Congress first considered the first round of compacts, and the notion was that Congress told the Pacific jurisdictions, American Samoa, Guam, CNMI, and Hawaii, we didn't want there to be adverse effects on your jurisdictions. Beginning with the amended compacts in 2003, there was $30 million a year for 20-year appropriation and authorization as part of that package. Those funds do end this fiscal year. And so that's been the extent of sort of a permanent authorization to address compact impact in the Pacific. In addition, there have been some congressional appropriations of discretionary funds. The recent, several year ago, change in Medicaid eligibility was, I think, a significant improvement in the lives of the COFA migrants, but it also provided a federal share of the cost of health care, which a lot of the states were picking up on.
We'll need you to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, I'll stop.
The chair now recognizes Representative Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm so happy that actually you're leading this hearing on such an important issue, not just for the United States, but for the whole region. All of us has traveled for many of the countries, and we've been seeing the Belt and Road Initiative, and we also saw many examples of what's happening whatever the Communist China is doing, investments or upgrades in infrastructure in countries like North Macedonia, African countries, and many others. So this is not new. What is new here is that the United States needs to engage with the free associated compacts that are going to expire now in 2023, and we're talking not just Palau in 2024, Micronesia Islands in 2023, and the Marshall Islands in 2023. I think what Chairman Westerman brought to the table, it's important in a bipartisan way that we should actually be looking forward to receive those negotiations and try to establish and continue to deter the malign influence of the Communist China in the Pacific region. So to that end, I do have questions to Mr. Grossman. U.S. analysts and officials have long expressed concern about Communist China investment in commercial seaports, airports, and other infrastructure projects around the world, and how those investments facilitates the expansion or establishment of a formal military presence in those areas. Similar concerns have also been raised with security agreements with the Communist China to train and provide equipment to local law enforcement officials. Could you discuss how this is playing out with respect to the Indo-Pacific region and its implications for U.S. security interests in the region? And that means how the Communist China is leveraging to support for infrastructure and security upgrades in Pacific Island countries to establish a permanent base and weaken U.S. partnerships in the region. And of course, I know in your testimony you mentioned concerns surrounding the agreement with the Solomon Islands and the upgrades to their airstrip in Kiribati, which could be an airbase for the Chinese influence. I will be happy to hear your comments on that.
Thank you, Congresswoman. A lot to unpack there, but very briefly, I will say that kind of the poster child for U.S. concerns about what China is doing in terms of BRI infrastructure to different countries is Sri Lanka. A number of years ago, China offered to build up the port of Colombo in Sri Lanka. When the bill came due, Sri Lanka couldn't pay, and China said, well, what else do you have for us? And it turns out China now operates out of Hambantota port in the south of Sri Lanka on a 99-year lease. It's very rare that you see 99-year leases, but for China, this is pretty common practice. And the question is, what are their long-term ambitions there? Is it purely commercial, or is there something else? I will just make sure everyone understands that Hambantota is along sea lines of communication within the Indian Ocean, basically connecting Asia to the Middle East and to Europe and Africa. So it's a pretty important corridor. But in the Pacific, we see similar types of activities. Before right after the Solomon Islands switched recognition from Taiwan to China in 2019, we then had a New York Times expose about how China was trying to essentially forge a similar deal on one of the islands, Tulagi, in the Solomon Islands, 75-year lease for Tulagi, but once it became exposed, that deal essentially went away. So yeah, we have concerns about what they're trying to do through BRI. And on the policing issue, this is not the first time China has done this, with Solomons. Fiji, you can go back to 2011, there was an agreement, but now the new government in Fiji is starting to reconsider whether that's a good idea, because we are conveying to them, you may not want to have an authoritarian regime essentially treating your local law enforcement. That might not be a good idea if you want to maintain a democratic system.
Thank you. And I know Mr. Gray proposed National Security Council-led interagency policy process, including direct level precision focusing on U.S. territories. I know my time is going to expire, but I would love to know more about how we can make that happen and help tackle those threats and strengthen our efforts to counter Communist China malign influence in the region.
Yeah. Thank you, Congresswoman. I would just add to my written testimony and what I said earlier, that the way the National Security Council is structured now, there really isn't any focus specific to our territories. They're treated as an ancillary part of whether it's our Asia Directorate or, in the case of Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, our Western Hemisphere Directorate. The issues obviously are unique, the challenges are unique, the legal structure is unique, so having a personnel who are devoted to that issue specifically and can work cross-functionally across different issues and regions, I think that would allow this challenge to receive the bureaucratic attention that it needs instead of being treated as an afterthought, which too often it is now.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carl for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm so sorry for jumping up and down, but nothing like having 3 committee meetings going at one time. Mr. Gray, I got a quick question for you. Thank you all for being here. The CCP concerns me. I've seen firsthand the impact of the CCP's use of soft power down in Central and South America. I've been doing some lack of better terms, research down there. The CCP is active in countries in our hemisphere, building everything from road and soccer stadiums. They're doing this in our backyard, and it deeply troubles me because they're trying to replace a U.S. influence in these areas. I think that goes without saying. So I'm worried similar things are happening in the Indo-Pacific area. I believe it is incredibly important. We must push back against the efforts of the CCP to spread its influence in the Indo-Pacific area, which is likely the location for the future armed conflict. Mr. Gray, can you talk to me a little bit about how the PRC's influence has spread across the Pacific Islands?
Thanks, Congressman, and you're absolutely right that it's a Pacific issue, but it's a global issue as well. The way in which the CCP, really they took advantage of our kind of strategic distraction in the early 2000s and the 2010s, and they began a process of, you can look at it in kind of a multi-front way. First, there's infrastructure like Mr. Grossman alluded to, BRI, going in and spending vast sums of money, often at usurious interest rates, to build projects that ostensibly these small developing states want. Too often these projects end up being white elephants. They end up being infrastructure that doesn't work or ends up leaving the country worse off than it was when it began. They do elite capture. They're very good at taking elites. Solomon Islands is a great example, wining and dining them in Beijing, giving them the attention that, frankly, they don't always get from the United States and our allies. And they do a very good job at prioritizing for influence and access the countries that they view as strategic. And so we've watched as Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, the freely associated states, even to some extent the U.S. territories where they view there to be a strategic interest, they've applied all of these tools of national power to exert influence. And it's been a steady 15-year process of moving across the Pacific and beginning to penetrate farther and farther past the second island chain.
And I've seen down in Panama, the canal, they did a project for the Panamanian government down there and messed it up. We've got the Corps of Engineers down there now trying to figure out how to fix it. So it's not the best of quality, I might add, for future reference, the work that they actually do. Given the U.S. has 3 territories and international agreements with the Pacific Island countries that are so close to China, how can we use those relationships to push back against the CCP's influence in that region?
Well, Congressman, I think that first, the U.S. territories and the freely associated states are extraordinary. If you look at it in just strategic terms, they're extraordinary strategic assets for the United States that have to be continuously safeguarded and cultivated. We take them for granted at our peril. And from a strategic standpoint, having South Pacific projection in American Samoa, having projection as far into the Western Pacific as Palau through our compact there, those are incredibly significant for us. And so I would say, as a matter of policy, we have to, obviously renewing the compacts is critical, but then elevating the resources and the attention that we give to our territories. Congresswoman Radowagon talked about our Coast Guard station in American Samoa. That is an easy way to project U.S. power farther into the South Pacific, combat Chinese illegal fisheries activity, and to penetrate farther into a sub-region where China has been operating with almost impunity in some ways, and the United States has been very late to the game. With just a little investment of resources, we can do a tremendous amount to push back there.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, and thank you again to the committee for coming and speaking to us. Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize Mr. Moylan for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to continue on with the line of questioning for my congressman here from Hawaii. In line with that, we talk about the grant there, Mr. Freeberg, about the grant assistance for Guam, CNMI, and Hawaii for us hosting the COFA migrants, which we're happy to do. But this grant amount, for the last 20 years, we've had objections with that amount. This $30 million is shared amongst, right? And we have continuous conversation throughout these years to say this amount wasn't sufficient. And now we're seeing the Biden administration not even asking to include this in your testimony. It's ending, and it's not even going to be included. So if we know it wasn't fair from the start, and now we're still going to have this going on, how does that help us? We want to help. Our resources are being used, but let me ask you a question. Would you see the benefits of legislation which intends to reauthorize and expand these grant assistance programs, those states and territories who continue to be COFA host communities? In other words, we put legislation out there. Tell us the benefits of how that can help the hosting nations. This goes to anyone who wants to start. Mr. Freeberg.
Okay, thank you for the question. And I could just sort of put a point on sort of the relative magnitudes we're talking about. In like 2018, I think Hawaii was recording $183 million in compact cost and receiving roughly $15 million. Guam was recording $147 million per year and receiving probably around $13 million. And the remaining amount primarily went to the Mariana Islands, and a small amount went to American Samoa. And so that was a fixed amount. And so clearly very small relative to the cost of educating, providing health care, the cost of public safety for these migrant populations. One thing that was true by the time we got to 2019 time period is about half of the COFA migrants at that point were on the mainland. Very large communities in Arkansas, Washington State, Oregon, California, Texas, and frankly just scattered throughout the country. And so that was, roughly 100,000 people had migrated, and about half at that point were no longer in Pacific regional areas. And so I think it's a good question, and it's really a hard one, I think, to address about what is the compensation package. One thing I did suggest in my oral comments and in the written comments is that right now, the compact migrants are not treated as well as people who are lawful permanent residents or have green cards, and they simply have better access to some federal programs. And having those programs, having access to those programs, would reduce some of the costs to some of the jurisdictions who are providing other social support to those households. And I think it is really about these COFA families. They're important parts of our American community. They're important economically, and it's really making this a relationship that reaches all the way from those communities back to the COFA nations. And that's my sort of thought of this. Maybe some of my other panel members have other ideas.
I appreciate that, but we're going to continue to receive the migrants coming on in. And now at this point, without any grant at all. And the Biden administration didn't even at least request for Congress to consider that reimbursement, even though we've been shortchanged from the start. You know, we love our sister nations. We want to help the come, and they're going to continue to come. But now, you know, we need to help our hosting nations. Mr. Gray, can I have your comment on that, please?
Congressman, I certainly don't pretend to be an expert on compact impact, like some of my other colleagues, but I will say that if we're going to have these compacts, which are strategically vital, we have to have a formula in which the compact impact is mitigated in a way that allows us to continue, frankly, with the support that we need within the United States to continue those relationships. And if we don't have the funding formula correct for compact impact, it is going to, over time, I think, degrade the support for the strategic relationships. And so I completely agree with you that we've got to find the way to mitigate those challenges.
Mr. Grossman, you got a couple of seconds, if you mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been sufficiently covered. I mean, I guess the one thing I would add is that we also have to keep in mind that in future renewals, other issues will crop up in COFA renegotiations, such as, I think climate change was an issue this time, at least for Marshall Islands, perhaps for the others as well, and then, you know, nuclear testing legacy. So those are things that we have to be prepared to have an answer for in the future when dealing with renewal.
Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize Chairman Westerman for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thank you to the witnesses. And as we've discussed already, I mentioned this in some of my opening remarks, the U.S. compacts with the FAS countries are a balance of extraordinary security and defense right and strategic stability secured for the U.S. and extraordinary economic gains and stability for the freely associated states. Ms. Pascal, could a COFA model with less comprehensive or extensive economic and security cooperation be calibrated and applied elsewhere to enable maybe a soft bilateral and multilateral cooperation?
I think that offer was made. There would be several countries that would be interested. In fact, I know of at least one that was actively interested in it. And it's partially out of fear of what China's doing. And a lot of this discussion, as Congressman Case was saying, okay, what do we do now about it? We know China's a problem. And a lot of this discussion has sort of implied that the countries are choosing between two systems, two kind of equal things, China and the U.S. And if you've got Chinese police trainers, they're the same basically as American or Australian police trainers, but they're fundamentally different. The Belt and Road Initiative exports a system. BRI can stand for Bribery and Repression Initiative. What goes into those countries at the ground level is incredibly socially disruptive. And many of the countries in the region, for example, Nauru might be one, is scared and wants to look for another model. Nauru recognizes Taiwan. Tuvalu recognizes Taiwan. They're doing so because of what was in the last 2 pages of President Penuela's letter, in which he said, these are the problems we're having with China. That's why we want to recognize Taiwan. And I think there's a big question about why FSM, the core part of the freely associated states, the big part in the middle, wasn't encouraged to recognize Taiwan. That gets right to the heart of what some of the U.S. opinions, especially I would say in state, towards the region is. And there's a very big divergence on the ground among how defense interacts with the region and how state interacts with the region. And I think that's delivering a confused message. So from a Defense Department perspective, I think there'd be a lot of support for expanding compacts to other nations. state, I'm not so sure. So that's a discussion that maybe would be beneficial to have a little bit more highlighting on within the U.S. system.
But you see that as beneficial strategically for the U.S. to do that?
I think it would be incredibly helpful, and it would be a symbol like no other that the U.S. is serious about being in the Pacific. We'll have President Biden going to Papua New Guinea on May 22nd. There'll be a meeting of Pacific Island leaders there. That meeting was actually convened by India, and President Biden is kind of showing up and having the engagement there to show that there is interest in the region. That sort of thing is very helpful, but what would be more helpful, actually I'm not sure it's very helpful, but what would be more helpful is this sort of actual institutional engagement between the countries that can lead to pathways of interaction that's military, economic, social, political, creating this defensive barrier against the spreading authoritarianism across the region and bolstering of freedom and democracy across the region.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering to see what's resulted from places around the world where the Belt and Road Initiative has been applied. In your statement, you mentioned a letter from the former Micronesian president. What specifically does the letter highlight and that should be of concern?
It's a description of a complete subversion of sovereignty. He talks about not only bribery of specific individuals in his government, but things, just to give one case study that he uses, what happened with Sinovac. The U.S. delivered enough of its own vaccines for the entire country, for the entire Micronesia. China was insistent that Sinovac be accepted. The president said no. Suddenly he found one of his ministers saying, oh, you know what, we'll accept it just for the Chinese citizens in the country. And then the next thing he knew, it was being accepted for the entire country. It was a total bypassing of any sovereign decision-making by the president of a country if it went counter to PRC interests. The PRC also designated a citizen of FSM to represent the FSM at an international meeting with the PRC. It's a destruction of democracy and sovereignty on a scale that is incredibly hard to imagine. We're seeing it happen all across the region.
Thank you. And I've got more questions, but I don't have more time, so I'm going to yield back my remaining 10 seconds, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate you coming here today to engage in what's an extremely important discussion. I listened with great interest, and I think that everybody does recognize the challenges associated with China and the importance of these countries and islands in our South Pacific. So it is something that we take very seriously, and the fact that Chairman Westerman came and engaged with us today, I think, is a sign of that. I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members for your questions. I was just looking through some of the materials you've provided, and that definitely is going to be reading material that I will take home and spend more time studying, as this issue is going to be coming up over the next 6 to 8 months. And I hope that we also will have an opportunity to come and visit some of the islands as well to get a firsthand understanding of the situation that we are dealing with in the South Pacific. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, May 19th, 2023. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Sorry?
Those were great answers.
Oh, thank you.